Yeah, so it all begins to tie in. And so we have this sacred stone as being one of the key elements. And where did it go to? Which is one of the key aspects of this. Well, the last we really know of it is in 3rd century Rome, because Emperor Elagabalus was the high priest of the Elagabal, which is the sacred stone, same conical stone. And in fact, this is very interesting because it gives us a proper picture of what this stone looks like. And again, I'm sure you'll put this up on the video for viewers to have a look at. But because it went to Rome, and we have Roman sculptors who can actually give us a good image, the coins of Elagabalus give us an exact picture of what the stone looked like. And it's a conical stone, but embossed upon the stone is the image of the phoenix. So it's the same as the Egyptian idea where the phoenix was linked to the Benben stone. The same as in Arthurian legend where Wolfram von Eschenbach. And this is interesting, actually, because Wolfram von Eschenbach in Parsifal says that the Grail stone was very, very closely linked to the phoenix. And he specifically mentions the phoenix as being the emblem of the Grail stone. And then you look at the coins of Elagabalus, and there's no way, I'm sure, that Wolfram would have ever seen a coin of Elagabalus. But you look at the coins of Elagabalus, and you've got the Grail stone, and you have the phoenix embossed upon it. So this tradition obviously came all the way through to the 13th century when Wolfram was writing his manuscript, and he knew about this even though he had never seen a coin of Elagabalus. Anyway, so we have images of this particular stone in the 3rd century in Rome, because Elagabalus took it to Rome. But when he was murdered, because he didn't last very long, the stone disappears. And we don't exactly know where it went to. It is said that it went back to Syria, but we have no real evidence for that. I have a suspicion that it actually went to Chester in Britain, because we have this temple we were talking about, the temple of the zodiac, which is in Chester. And the Temple of the Zodiac has a strange history because it was built in AD 75, so just after the Jewish revolt. This entire fortress was built in AD 72, between AD 72 and 75, just after the Jewish revolt, which is one reason why I think it was linked to the rebels from the Jewish revolt. And then it lasted until about the turn of the century, when it was destroyed. And so this magnificent temple, which at the time was the finest building in the whole of Britain, was this temple stuck in this fortress in the middle of nowhere, was the most expensive and finest building anywhere in Britain, was destroyed.
It's a bloody park now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a car park now, unfortunately. But the history of it doesn't stop there, because we come on to the 3rd century, and it was rebuilt. Late 2nd century, early 3rd century. This same temple was rebuilt on the same spot and the same size. Not quite the same shape, because they had made, if you can imagine this sort of almond shape of the Vesica Piscis, it was made wider, and there's a specific reason why it was done that, which I go through in the book. But the same temple was rebuilt. And you have to wonder, this has to be political, religio-political for some reason, for a cathedral to be destroyed and then rebuilt, 100 years later, 150 years later. Why did they rebuild it? I've got a suspicion that the stone ended up in this particular cathedral, the Temple of the Zodiac. Because as you've been through in a lot of your talks and in a lot of your books, we then have the history of this stone being a central component within sort of Celtic type history.
Yeah.
Within Irish history, and then the Stone of Scone, obviously in Scotland. We have this same history of a sacred stone and a sacred bloodline, as it were, to go with it, becoming a central part of the history in this part of the world.
Well, it's interesting also that some of the stuff you've been talking about actually exists in well-known fiction. There's many examples, but I've been decoding the work of Professor Tolkien, say C.S. Lewis, and in C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, when Aslan, who's a character that really is obviously a very plain and clear metaphor for the Christ, when he's finally martyred by the female, by the way, who's the anti-character,
right?
The evil one. It's on a stone. It's actually on a stone table, and it's not a dolmen, because no Christian like C.S. Lewis would be mentioning a Celtic artifact like a dolmen. So this stone upon which Aslan is then killed and resurrects later on is the stone that you're talking about.
Yeah, because it was a central part of Judean history as well. It was the stones from the Ark of the Covenant, and it was the central component, I believe, within Judean religion, because the sacred day of modern Judaism is the Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur is supposed to be the day of, how do they explain it?
Atonement?
Atonement, yeah. But within Aramaic, Kippur also means the stone. This is where we get Cephas from.
How about that?
Kephas means stone, and Kippur is the same word in Aramaic. It means stone. So it can be the Day of Atonement. It can also be the Day of the Stone.
Well, interestingly, you see, Lewis and Tolkien, just to go back to that, were brilliant at philology, weren't they? So even the word Aslan, some of the terms that they're using, people know this about Tolkien, but they're not so aware of it with Lewis, that they were masters of medieval languages and all that rest of it. So there's no doubt that they would have known some of the etymology you're talking about.
And same with the Grimm's fairy tales, of course. The brothers Grimm were linguists. That's where they came from. And so they are mixing all sorts of languages and metaphors within the stories they're making. This is why I make a point of comparing fairy stories with this story. You know, the Sleeping Beauty story, you know, of the princess asleep, the Rapunzel story of the princess stuck in a tower, and of course Magdalene means the tower, and of course the princess in Arthurian history is Guinevere, and she gets stuck in a tower as well. So we have Guinevere, who is Mary Magdalene, of course. She is the wife of Arthur, and the wife of King Jesus was Mary Magdalene. So Guinevere is Mary Magdalene, and Guinevere gets stuck in a tower. She's either locked up there by Mordred, who's the son of Jesus, son of Arthur Jesus, or she is taken there by Lancelot as the lover of Lancelot, but she ends up in a tower. She ends up in a Magdalene. And so we have this Rapunzel story of letting down her golden hair, and of course Mary Magdalene had golden hair from the tower.
Yeah, she's the orange, right? As you pointed out in your Mary book, she's orange.
Yes, she is the Princess of Orange, with the golden hair.
Interestingly, Cybele, I said earlier that one of Cybele's cardinal symbols was the circlet. The other symbol by which Cybele was known was the crenellated tower.
Ah, yes, of course it was. Yes, she had it as her headdress.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And that's the Mark Masons of England, the Mark Masonry, and so many Masonic orders show this castle motif or tower motif.
Yes, so she was a Magdal. Yes, she was a Magdalene. Yeah, interesting. I don't mention that. I should mention that in another book somewhere. I must mention.
Well, it's the bloodline, isn't it? The men were coming from Attis, the castrated, the castrati. They were mimicking Attis, and the women came from their side, like you said, it's like a two-tailed comet. The females are basing themselves on the symbolism of Cybele. The men are basing themselves on that, but also of Attis, Dionysus, whatever.
Yeah. Yes, they were all imitating the lives and the positions of the gods. They were all. That's why Jesus was called a son of God, of course, because they were all descended from the gods, as it were. Not necessarily literally, but certainly metaphorically, they were all descended from the gods. So he was the son of the god, just as all of the Egyptian pharaohs were all sons of gods. In fact, even the Roman emperors became sons of gods as well. But the Egyptian pharaohs would have been Ra-Moses, the son of Ra, and Ar-Moses, the son of the moon, Tuthmoses, the son of Thoth. They were all sons of God. So they're all mimicking and taking on the roles of the gods and acting out the lives of the gods, because I suppose through mimicry you become as powerful as the gods. You become part and parcel of the god story.
It's like that sympathetic magic idea.
Yeah.
And like in Hollywood today, where you've got these actors that become movie stars, and they play different roles, but they're kind of typecasted, all of them, if you think about it, and they play different roles in different stories. But when you decode these movies, as I know Michael's done a great deal of work on, you start to see that these modern day movies, sci-fi or not, or whatever kind of special effects they use, they're really just mimicking these ancient stories and myths and legends that are just reenactments of things like the Arthurian legend. And you see the story of Jesus and the Christ figure and all of that throughout all these movies, the Matrix movies. It's throughout everything, and you see the same things coming up even in modern day movies.
Yeah, and sometimes they are handing on esoteric information through those movies. I'm sure a lot of the things I've seen in Dark Skies and the X-Files and all of those sort of things are handing over esoteric information that is difficult to handle in any other fashion. So in effect, these filmmakers have the same problem that the original Arthurian authors have. How do you handle this information without being, in medieval period, without being strung up or roasted over over hot coals? Yeah. In the modern fashion, how do you mention this story and retell this story without being ostracized and lose your job, lose your position, whatever, ridiculed in the media? How do you tell that story? Well, you do it through metaphor and through all these various stories that retell and recast the same story in a different fashion. I'm only slightly disappointed that they've never done it with Arthurian history before, because it seems so obvious to me that Arthurian history is retelling the biblical story, and yet nobody has actually tried to convey that within modern history that I've seen.
What do you think happened to the stone? What do you think? You said that the temple was rebuilt, but then of course later in history it gets destroyed. What's your idea of where the stone is now then? I
think it has to be linked with the Stone of Scone. So I think it has to have perhaps gone up to Scotland, because it lasted, the temple at Chester lasted until the fall of Roman Britain, which is about the early 5th century, about 410 AD. So at that point, the second temple at Chester is then destroyed. And the whole of Britain, of course, crumbles, and all of society crumbles, all of the economy crumbles, everything crumbles. And so at that point, the stone is open for whoever can take it, I suppose. And it's quite possible that invading Picts and Scots and so on, because they were the people, obviously, who were invading Britain at that time, managed to take the stone, because we have no real history of it after that point, until, of course, we get this history of the Stone of Scone arriving in later centuries.
Well, if it went to Scotland, that's interesting too, because then it means that there could be a Templar connection yet again. They might have got hold of it.
Yeah, indeed. They would probably have known about it if it went up to Scotland. Or anywhere else. I'm sure the Templars would have got to have known about it. In fact, I went to a Temple Lodge meeting because the Knights Templar have a modern incarnation within Masonry. And so I went to a lodge meeting of Knights Templar in Scotland, at Roslin, in fact. The master there had a video. He was convinced that they had the real Stone of Scone, because the Stone of Scone that they gave to Edward I was a fake, of course. So the one that ended up in Westminster Abbey is a fake. He was convinced that they still have and still guard the Stone of Scone, the real Stone of Scone. And he made a video, which was quite professionally done. It was it was a computer video made of this stone, which showed it levitating. So he had this stone, which was not entirely conical. It looked more like those stones, those curling stones that they use in Scotland, you know, for they run them across the ice to as a part of a game.
Yeah.
And it looked like one of those stones, a curling
stone. We do a lot of that here in Canada too.
Oh, you do it over there as well. So you'll know all about it. So you have this curling stone, which is a stone made of granite, and they run it across the ice. And it looked like that, but it levitated. So it could fly. And, I mean, this was a level-headed guy. You know, he was a professional. He was a master mason. He was the head of the Templar Lodge. And he was convinced that this is what this stone did. These are the, you know, abilities that this stone had. And they had made this video of this, quite a nice little video actually, of this stone. And yeah, so there is this tradition, and I've not seen the stone, so I've got no idea whether this is, you know, based in fact or not. But there is a strong tradition within modern Templar history within Scotland that the stone ended up, it was the Stone of Scone. It was the stone upon which the Scottish kings were when what do you call it, when the kings were made into kings, and it still exists, and it's still somewhere up around Roslin area. So yeah, interesting story. So the history we have of this stone sort of fades into mythology. We don't know much about it, and I wish we did.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating, because again, the fusion of those two stories or mythos, you know, of the true identity of Arthur, but then this other incredible item or artifact, you know, the Grail, and as you say, the decoy of making it into a plate or making it into a cup or even into a table, you know, and everyone running off looking for those artifacts, in one way is a perfect ruse, because then the thing that it really is, which you can only decode through the etymology, you know, remains sort of unknown. And it could be right there in front of everybody's face and not getting it at all. But as I said, through the, you know, I got to it through the Tolkien, through the C.S. Lewis, through the fictional aspects. But again, by taking that, as well as all the mythologies of Britain, at face value, actually, you know, as historical records, not as fairy folk tale. And then you come at these motifs, not quite completely having it decoded, you know, but there it lies in the great legends, you know, whether it be Excalibur or whether it be, you know, some a Welsh tale of the zodiac, or, you know, the female figure that appears, and as I said, is always an attendant. And so you start to realize, yeah, it's the female herself that's the real Grail, her womb, her traditions, her rites, not necessarily embodied in a particular symbol, but again, could be very much embodied in a symbol, you know, and then you keep seeing the recurrent motifs of the mount. But the fact that this, you know, the symbol of the tower, the symbol of the Grail, you know, and the Melchizedek, all dating back to the biblical family. This is extraordinary. You know, in my work, you mentioned earlier on about Magnus Maximus, the crazy sort of semi-legendary king.
Yes.
And that helped you to date his antics, helped you to see that there was a gap and something really off with the chronology. You had more that showed you that than just his existence, but his existence and his antics show you that there's something wrong with the timeline. But then he's meant to have married. See, I'm just illustrating the things that interested me, because he had entered as a character into my ideas of the Atenist connection to Ireland because he is meant to have married this semi-mythical queen, isn't it? Ellen, or could be Helen with an H.
Yes.
And the moment that I notice that kind of statement, where they're talking about a wondrous or magical, sort of a female, especially if it's a female, whether it is Boadicea or whether it is a Lady of the Lake or Morgana Le Fay, and in this case we have the wife of Maximus being this weird, sort of wondrous Ellen. Then to me, that's, I unpack that as being, here's the Atnists again. It's not so much this Celtic fairy folklore, which is what they want you to think it is, so that then you don't see the more biographical stuff of the wondrousness of a character is actually their Egyptian roots or their mysteriousness, their foreign qualities, all of that. So there's this mysterious Helen or Ellen again, the etymology of her name being fascinating and all of the rest of it.
Because she was a very famous character, of course. She was the grandmother of Jesus, was called Helen.
Yeah.
This is the story I relate in Cleopatra to Christ, where this royalty went from Egypt. It was an Egyptian royalty from Cleopatra the Seventh, the famous Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar. They had a daughter, and this daughter ended up in Persia. She was sold off. She was a diplomatic bride who was sent to the king of Persia by Emperor Augustus. And so she became the wife of Phraates IV. And she was exiled after Phraates IV died or was murdered. She was exiled, and all her people were exiled from Persia in AD 4, and she was exiled from Persia to Syria. And so we have this story of a royal family being on the move with a child being born in a stable, as it were, carving out a new kingdom, city-state within northern Syria, which happened to be Edessa. And the name of this queen was Queen Thea Musa Aurania. And her daughter was the very famous Helena of Adiabene, Edessa.
Yeah.
And sorry, I was wrong. It's not grandmother. It was his mother was called Helena. So the mother of King Esus Manu of Edessa was Helena, the very famous Helena, Queen Helena, who became the Queen of Judea. She was the Queen of Judea in the 1st century. She is the famous queen who saved Judea from famine in AD 47. She is the famous Helena who furnished the Temple of Jerusalem, including the golden menorah, which she paid for. She is the famous Helena who had the biggest palace in Jerusalem and the biggest tomb in Jerusalem, which you can still see. The tomb is still there. You can still go there, although it's locked up at present. You can't go in it. So there was a very famous Helena of Judea, and she was the mother of Jesus. And she's not widely acknowledged in Judea, which is strange because she is the great hero or heroine of Judea. She saved Judea from famine. And I'll tell you a funny story about this, because I went to Israel. I've been there 3 or 4 times, and I went on this one occasion, and you get off the aircraft, and of course, as you can imagine, security is tight when you go through Tel Aviv airport, very tight, and they don't just scan parties of people. You get an individual interview as you come through. So I had my individual interview with this guy, and he was very thorough, very professional. And he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I'm investigating the history of Queen Helena, the Queen of Judea." And he said, "What? Oh, Queen Helena?" He said, "There is no such queen. Don't be stupid." I said, "Well, no, I'm here to investigate her history." He said, "Look, I'm born here. I was educated here. There is no Queen Helena." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but there is." Let's go on the internet. So he didn't believe me at all. So we get on the internet and we Google for Queen Helena, and there she is, Queen of Judea. He had no idea who this person was. So he said, "Oh, okay, you're right. Yeah, here's your visa. Off you go." So this very, very famous queen of Judea has been deleted from history, like all of these other people have been deleted from history, because her history is controversial, because she was the mother of Jesus. And the last thing anybody wants is for anyone to put two and two together and end up realizing that Queen Helena was the mother of Jesus. And so there's this conspiracy of silence between Christians who don't want you to know it, and the Jews don't really want you to know it either, because they don't want to rock the boat anyway, because Christianity has been the dominant force for the last 1,000 years or more. So they don't want to rock the boat, so they don't talk about her. And then Christianity invents a new Helena, because Helena was a problem for Christianity, because she was the mother of Jesus. Nobody wanted to know you that, because she was the heroine in the AD 60s, not the AD 30s, the AD 50s and 60s when she was around. And her husband is in the Acts of the Apostles, so we the Bible does know about it. He's called Agabus in the Acts of the Apostles, the king of Edessa. So what were the Catholic Church going to do about this? How could they get rid of this very famous Queen Helena? Well, what they did is they invented a mother of Constantine the Great, who was called Queen Helena, or at least they made her called Helena. And so they invented this Queen Helena, who's the mother of Constantine the Great, who was the inventor of Christianity, of course, and said that she went to Judea and she became the heroine of Judea, and she went looking for the history of Jesus in Judea. But this was a cover story, because what it did is it got rid of the original Helena of Judea, who went to Jerusalem to look for the history of Jesus, because Jesus was her son, of course. It got rid of this original Queen Helena, because any time anyone mentioned Queen Helena of Judea, they would say, oh, yeah, 4th century, yeah, mother of Constantine. And suddenly, the real Queen Helena had just disappeared. Her history had been deleted. And that's exactly what they did. And that's what they've done with a lot of this history. It's difficult to destroy it because it's too well known. You can't get rid of Queen Helena, but you can move her off from her original life. You can move her 3-4 centuries into the future, and then suddenly she's gone.
Right, and would this be, so when some traditions talk about her being an Edomite or connected to Petra and Bernice,
Yep.
This is, and even with Herod, who we know actually lived in France as much as he did in the Middle East. So
Yes.
Is this connected?
Well, yes. You mean the original Queen Helena? Yes, of course. Was she an Edomite? Yes, of course, because the Nazarenes were Edomites. They were the poor. And this is where we come back to crusading again. So, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Don't let me forget. She was a Nazarene, and we know that Queen Helena of Adiabene, Edessa, was a Nazarene because the Talmud tells us so. The Talmud says that she became a proselyte Jew, because they weren't originally Jews, but she became a proselyte, a convert to Judaism, and there were only two types of people who could become Jews in the 1st century, and one of them was the Palmyrans, of course. And she became a proselyte Jew, and she became a Nazarene, and she had to go through 7 years of initiation before she could become a Nazarene. And of course, Jesus was a Nazarene, as was Saul, St. Paul. He was also a Nazarene, as it says in Acts of the Apostles. And the Nazarene were the Ebionites. They were the same group. And the meaning of the Ebionites and the Boethians and the Nazarene, not the Nazarene, there's another one as well, I'll remember it soon, is it means the poor. Oh, the Essene. The Essene were called the poor as well. And so all of these groups were known as the poor. And then when you come on to the Crusaders, of course, and the central people who we were actually started off talking about 2 hours ago or more, were the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar were called the poor Knights of Christ. They were the poor. They were the Ebionites. So the Knights Templar were simply copying the same history, the same traditions as the Nazarene Ebionites of Judea. Part and parcel of the same story. And they were doing the same thing because Jesus was this big hero figure, the head of the Nazarene, the head of the Ebionites, and his church was based on the poor. So if you look at the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles, all of the members of his church had to give up their belongings to the church. So they ran like a communist system with a central money purse that was held by Judas. And nobody had any belongings. It was all part of a communist system that all wealth was given up to the church. Mm-hmm. And that's how the Knights Templar ran their system as well. If you became a Knights Templar, you had to give up your belongings and join the Knights Templar. So Jesus was running this particular system in Judea, fighting the Romans. And the Knights Templar were running exactly the same system with the same rules as well. So if you look at the covenant of the Knights Templar, it's exactly, in fact, it was based upon the rules of the Essene from the Dead Sea. They're almost identical. Yeah. So the Knights Templar were running the same regime, the same system, and fighting the Muslims for control of Judea. So they were following in the same history, doing exactly the same thing as the Nazarene of Jesus and James.
Now there is a... Oh, go ahead.
No, continue.
Well, I just wanted to get back to the Grail legend because one of the, I don't know if you've come across or have a comment to make on it, but one of the central motifs of the Grail legend, maybe coming out of Chrétien de Troyes or whatever, but alongside the Grail, you have the perennial symbolism of the spear, Longinus, spear of destiny, etc.
Yes.
I can see from what we've been talking about, that it could be just a straight symbol of castration again, because the piercing of the body of Jesus is the piercing of the penis. If the body and the penis are considered, as they often are, identical. So have you come across any more further depth to that symbol? Or maybe it also turned up as a symbol in England?
Yes. Well, I'm not sure about England, but it's certainly a central part of Arthurian history. Yeah. One of the primary symbols of Arthurian kingship was the bleeding spear. So the spear that dropped bloods from its tip, which is explained as being the spear that pierced the side of Jesus, of course, but that's just a diversionary story. We have this bleeding spear, and the wounded king, who was the Fisher King of Arthurian history, was wounded in several of these manuscripts by this spear being thrust through his loins. So the spear that castrates the wounded king to become the galley high priest was the spear of destiny. And so, yes, it's a symbol of castration, as well as being a symbol of Jesus as well. So, yes, the spear motif is a central component of Arthurian history, just as it is within biblical history as well.
Yeah, because we know that allegedly anyway, I'm not 100% believer in the story, but allegedly it was chased after by Nazis, more Wagnerian aspects of that tradition, but it was meant to be one of these tutelary symbols of the Aryan race and what have you.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a few major symbols that people would want to get hold of if you want to fundamentally understand what this history is about. And those symbols would be the bleeding spear, the Ark of the Covenant, and the sacred stones that went inside the Ark of the Covenant. And why would people want these symbols? Well, because this could be powerful. I mean, we don't know, because we don't know what the power of these stones was. We don't know what they were, how they worked, what they represented. But if you want to find out, you're going to need to find these symbols in order to find out what this was all about. In the very essence of this, at the first layer of this, we're probably talking about magnetism. Because this stone was supposed to be magnetic. The Ben stone was supposed to be a magnetic stone. The omphalos was also supposed to be magnetic, strongly magnetic. And this may be where we get the sword in the stone story from, because if you took a steel sword, an iron sword, it would get stuck on the stone.
Right, yeah.
And so we have the stone, a sword stuck on a stone. And it will be very difficult. And it would be actually very confusing. I mean, if you're medieval period, 1st century or whatever, and you've got a stone and you put it close to this, you put your sword close to this stone, something would grab it and take it from your hand and rip it out of your hand and stick it onto this magical stone. It would be very miraculous, Who was it that was grabbing your sword from you? So we could be talking about, and of course within Arthurian history, the Grail holders didn't use iron cutlery. They only used silver cutlery. So the knives that they used were silver, so they wouldn't get stuck on the stone. So we could be talking about something purely magnetic, which would not be terribly miraculous. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not terribly miraculous. But I suppose people are thinking, what if it was more than that? What if this stone was more powerful than just simple magnetism? This was a stone that was supposed to come from heaven. Was it simply a meteorite, which could indeed be magnetic? Or was it, as Arthurian history says, was it brought to Earth by aliens, an alien species? If it was the latter, it might be much more powerful than just simple magnetism. So if you want to discover what the history of this stone is and why it's so special, you would have to find all the symbols that lead you to where this stone would be. And that's probably part and parcel of the enduring mythology of why people have been chasing after the Holy Grail for thousands of years, and why people have been guarding the Holy Grail for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. I mean, why else would you spend so much time and effort over a simple stone? So we know it's not a simple stone. It's not a lump of granite. Otherwise, nobody would be quite so interested in it. There must be something a little bit special about it. So was it magnetism? Or was it something more than magnetism? We simply don't know.
And one has to really distinguish at some point, as you get more and more into it, of the metaphors that are used for it. Like the skull, which you see at the bottom of the cross, like the spear, which we say appears at the cross, the Roman soldier piercing Jesus' side and all of that. Or as we said, the Grail itself. I mean, you've got these giant fountains in St. Peter's Square. And not only that, you've got fountains in almost so many other civic centers representing that chalice or that Grail subliminally.
Yep.
Yes. But again, you've got to distinguish between those symbols that are metaphors for the original thing and then the more esoteric thing, because obviously the stone makes a lot of sense to me, since that is exactly what you have in a Masonic temple. You have the ashlar, don't you, the stones?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So this stone imagery is central to the Gospels, and it's also central to Masonry as well. So, as we said before, St. Peter was the stone. That was his title. Peter means stone. So Simon was his real name, and his title was Peter. Simon the stone. And within Masonry, the central component, of course, because it's all building metaphors, of course, was the stone, the rough ashlar that became the smooth ashlar. And Jesus himself was the cornerstone. Yeah. That was his title. So he was the stone as well. It's a central component of all of this mythology, all of this theology as well, Christian, and Muslim as well, because as you say, they have the Kaaba stone as well.
Well, I think tying back to what you're saying about it possibly connecting to the Ben stone of Egypt. Remember you were saying earlier on that the language we were talking about, Aramaic, finds its origins in Egypt. It's interesting tie-in that the Ben stone, if the Ben stone, like a little pyramidon, is glass or crystal, then the sun shining through it actually casts the 22 shapes in a proto form that actually make the Aramaic language. So there's a big circle tie-in here. And that could be the thing that they found sacred about the original stone. If the stone was crystalline, then any kind of light, let alone sunlight, passing through that stone casts shadows that then become those 22 hieratic symbolic, so the keepers of the language, the keepers of the script, the keepers of the letters. That could be what the sacredness of it is.
It's quite possibly. We simply don't know. We don't even know what the stone was made of, or what it looked like. It had lettering on it because it was supposed to tell the history of your family, your genealogy. So it had miraculous lettering on it, which would appear when you looked at it. It had the ability to feed all of the knights, so it was like a cornucopia. Yeah. But when Arthurian history says feeding the knights, I'm immediately thinking of feeding the 5,000. In the biblical story. So when the Bible talks about feeding the 5,000, it's not talking about food. It's talking about knowledge, because bread in the New Testament means knowledge, and that's perfectly clear within the story of the Greek woman. The Greek woman wants Jesus' blessing, and he flicks her away and calls her a dog. And she says, yes, master, but even dogs can have the crumbs from the master's table. And within the Nag Hammadi Gospels, it is made perfectly clear that the bread is not real bread, the crumbs. It's knowledge, is what it says. So bread within the Gospels means knowledge. Yeast, what do they call it in the King James? They call it the leaven, don't they? The yeast. The leaven is what makes the knowledge bigger, because it raises the bread, of course, doesn't it? So it expands the knowledge and spreads the knowledge out, is the yeast or the leaven. So we're talking about knowledge here, not food. So when Arthurian history says that the Grail stone feeds the knights, it's feeding them knowledge. It's not feeding them real food.
And as a metaphor for that, you keep seeing light. Even in the Hollywood renditions, the Grail emits light, which is equivalent to knowledge, which is equivalent to the spiritual food, isn't it?
Yeah, as it says in the Gospel of John. I am the light. I am the logos, the word, and the light go together.
So it's interesting. That could tie into the pineal gland. That could tie into the letters, because you have the Illuminati pyramid with the removed capstone, the Ben. So there's something going on there where that's been equivalent to the pineal gland, which is another form of light, to melatonin. You got a lot of stuff going on in this symbol.
Oh yeah, it's been a part and parcel of all of this history that has been written about, especially recently, of course, within the last few decades. It's all components of this same history, and the problem is wrapping it all up and gathering it all together and making the links and finishing the crossword, as I called it in the beginning of this book, as I say in the beginning of the Grail Cypher, that this is not simply just a cipher, although there are many ciphers within this book that I've written, because they love playing with language, I tell you. But it's a crossword as well. You've got to fit all of these words together and make them into a recognizable pattern. And until you can see that pattern emerging, you've not solved the mystery. So a lot of people saw individual words within this crossword, but nobody before has seen the entire puzzle and fitted all the words together.
If you look at the Da Vinci Code ending, which to me is actually one of the more interesting parts of the movie. After he's cut himself shaving, then he runs out into the streets because he saw the trail of blood on the sink, and then he runs out of the apartment and ends up at the Louvre where that pyramid is. He kneels down very much like a Knight Templar would do, minus the sword, and he looks downwards, and then the final shot of the movie is the camera panning way, way down underneath. Well, Chartres Cathedral is based on, Mary being underneath, or she's actually known as the Lady of the Underground Place. It's beyond Mary. It's much more ancient than that. It probably does go back to Cybele and what have you. And there it is right at the end of the movie. The spear is Pallas Athena's symbol, right? Isn't it?
Yes.
Which connects to Shakespeare. And it just goes on. So decoding these symbols.
They're all over the place.
It's all over the place. In British writing, in mythology, so history is one place to look, but then one must have the ability to be able to swing over, pendulum-like, from the histories to the mythologies, from the folk tales. Anyone who's got this didactic mentality is simply not going to crack this. Your work takes us through that, from the astrology, to the history, to the mythos again, and to the symbolism. And this is this incredible effect of gathering, from all of these different sources to compile a picture, whereas history has been so linear, for far too long, and they've missed these priceless gems, really.
Yeah, totally. And as you say, probably coming back to the astrology is one of the central aspects of this, and perhaps we ought to discuss that a little bit more.
Please do.
They've totally lost the meaning of the astrology. You have all of these wonderful astrologers making monthly pronouncements in the in magazines and newspapers, and totally missed the whole point of what the astrology is about. And it goes back to the very beginning of this mystery, and is so closely connected with the Grail itself, that this was not monthly astrology. Of course, this was processional astrology. This was the millennial astrology. And there is a wonderful ending in this book, which is not fully formed. So I can see a sequel coming here somewhere. There's got to be a sequel, hasn't there?
Yeah.
Right.
But Arthur was buried at Stonehenge. Strangely, within the Arthurian history, Monmouth and Oxford are the ones who really make this clear, that the kings of Arthurian legend were all buried at Stonehenge. So Pendragon was, Aurelius was buried, and the son of Arthur, who was called Constantine for some reason, very strange, he was buried at Stonehenge. And I think it's quite possible that Arthur, the Arthur Jesus character, was buried at Stonehenge as well. And that makes Stonehenge a central element of this story. Jesus was buried there. Jesus, Arthur character, was buried there because he had been incarcerated in Chester, which is, just up the road on the borders of Wales. But what are you going to do with this character when he dies? Because you don't want to take his remains back to Judea, where they can foment further revolt. The whole point of this escapade was to reduce the revolutionary aspects of Nazarene Judaism in Judea. The last thing you wanted to do is take remains back there, which could be the focus for further revolt in Judea. So he's going to have to be buried somewhere in Britain. And where better than Stonehenge? Because Stonehenge is connected with this story. So this story is all about astrology. And I deduced this quite a long time ago, way back in 96, 97, I think it was, with Thoth, Architect of the Universe, where Stonehenge is actually an image of the precessional rotation of the Earth. And it's difficult to imagine without a diagram, but I'll send a diagram on so you can just put up the diagram and people just can have a quick look at it. And if you look at Stonehenge, the stone part of the henge, but then it has a earth bank henge around it. And within that earth bank henge, there are two small circles. And those two small circles are the ecliptic circles in the heavens above. So when the earth rotates, it not only rotates on its axis, but it precesses around, and that is precession. That's the wobble of the earth as it rotates. And it just so happens that the layout of Stonehenge mimics that rotation perfectly. And it is absolutely perfectly. And we even know the angle of obliquity of the Earth because Stonehenge tells us that it's 22.5 degrees. It's now 23.5 degrees, and there is a good reason for the 1 degree difference. So whoever designed and laid out Stonehenge understood the precession of the equinox very accurately. And the precession of the equinox is the basis of the precessional zodiac, because as the Earth wobbles, so all of the zodiac constellations rotate around the Earth, apparently. And it's that rotation and that precession of the zodiac constellations which give you the dates throughout history. So you can date any period within history by looking at the constellations of the zodiac within precessional astrology,
which was key. It was key to your book, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, because you're dealing very strongly there with that precessional movement from Taurus into Aries, and then from which then split the Ammonists, and that's what Atonism is from an astrological point of view. It is the cult who decided to go with the precessional change and change the mythographs and the rites, the terrestrial equivalent, whereas the Ammonists were saying, no, we read it differently, and we're sticking with the old system.
We're sticking with the old one, yes.
But the thing is that right near Stonehenge, not far from Stonehenge, well, first of all, within the last 6 months, they've discovered a massive extra megalithic complex in the Stonehenge area. That's one thing. And secondly, you've got your Somerset and Kingston zodiacs. So anyone doubting what you're saying, there's our whole earthwork zodiacs in the countryside of England, which can only be seen, from high places. So there's something extraordinary going on, which does link to sort of a more of an extraterrestrial tie-in there. And those zodiacs are not monthly zodiacs either. Those are definitely precessional, phenomena.
Yeah, and this, of course, goes back into prehistory. So this is not a tradition that was brought to Britain by Jesus being exiled there in AD 70. This is a tradition, obviously, that goes back way beyond that, thousands of years beyond that. And so this history, the same processional astrology as the central religion, was a central component of British history, just as it was a central component of Egyptian history and Syrian history. So it was pan-European. It was probably pan-global as well, across the whole of the world, that many cultures, many civilizations had the same way of looking at the universe through the zodiac and the precessional zodiac. And interestingly, the Stonehenge zodiac appears to have 30 symbols, not 12. So it was a slightly different zodiac. Because it doesn't have to be 12 symbols of the zodiac. That's only by convention. And so you have this division where in the normal zodiac you have 12 zodiacs which are separated by 30 degrees. That's the angle between each of the zodiacs. And in the British one, it looks like you have 30 zodiacs separated by 12 degrees. So it's the same idea, but you just end up with more pictograms in the sky than with the Judean example.
Well, one intriguing. Go ahead.
No, you continue.
Well, it's just that Gerald Massey said that, because you were talking about the celestial sphere intersecting with the ecliptic.
Yes.
That's not new either. That goes to Egypt. Gerald Massey had an interesting slant which confirms what you're saying, where he said that the concepts originally of heaven and hell. Now, we got to understand that the Egyptian concept wasn't anything like what it's become today. But the heavens and hell, the heaven and the hell, or the Amenta, the underworld and the overworld, were actually just those two interlocking planes. The horizon of one represented the underworld, horizon of the other, represented what would be called the heaven or the underworld. And the hero, the Sun King, must, go between two of these. He must go into the underworld, and it's during this underworld aspect that he then comes under the dominion of the female, the dark female, the sorceress, which then, as we've been saying all the way through this, turns up as your Mary, or your Grail Maiden, or your Morgana Le Fay, or your Cybele priestess types. All of that comes in because there are these two extreme phases of the ritual that the king...
And it's funny you should say that, because I've not come across that before. So this is where, this sharing of information, this confluence of ideas is hugely beneficial. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of spin-offs from this, because I didn't know about that. But I can see exactly what you're meaning, because the daily rotation is the obvious rotation. Yeah. You can see that rotation in the heavens above. So, yeah, that's the obvious world. The one you can't see, the hidden rotation, is the ecliptic circle.
Yeah.
Because you cannot understand that. You cannot know about that unless someone has initiated you. So that's the hidden, that's the underground circle. It makes perfect sense. Absolutely perfect sense.
Is it, I don't know, you're an expert on this, but the hieroglyphic in Egypt for horizon, doesn't it show kind of two pillars?
Yeah, it's two mounds either side with a dip in the middle, and the sun is in the dip. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just thinking now that's what Massey was referring to. You see these two pillars in the moon card of the tarot, and I think a couple of other cards. It's like two blank, nondescript mounds or towers, and they represent the colliers. But yeah, as far as he was concerned, it's definitely the night and day, which then metaphoricizes into the overworld and underworld. I'd have to look it up more, but that's and it's in the latter stage. It's in this darker Nekia that then the dark female appears, as not only a birther but a potential destroyer. There's a dual aspect of the terrible mother, but also at the same time this redeeming. You get the two women at the foot of the cross. You get it all the way through the Jesus story. You're putting the biography to that, but then behind that's the mythology as well of the two aspects of the single female. It's really incredible.
And the two pillars, of course, being the two pyramids sort of idea, with the sun setting between the two, because
exactly.
The pyramids of Giza have got to be central to this story. Just all of the megalithic monuments are central to this story. So just as Stonehenge is central to the story, Avebury is central to the story. And I have a great picture of Avebury, of course, in one of my books, in the Thoth book. Yeah, where it's a picture of the Earth, and it's such an obvious picture of the Earth, it's untrue. And
I had the opportunity to go down to, when I was in Ireland there, go down to places like Newgrange and Noth and some of these other very interesting places, and just looking at the same kind of concepts and just the meticulous nature on how they're made and the type of stones that they're using, and it's just the placement of them, the alignment with the constellations, etc. They're all over, and then that's just you go around the world and you just see this entire prehistorical remnant of these structures and this knowledge that's there. And then of course when you link the stories and the myths and everything into it, and then you weave in the actual history, man, like we could be getting a grasp finally on where we came from and what was really going on.
These henges are representations of the womb again. So we're coming back to the royal bloodline princess story, where the womb and the bloodline is important. The henges are the womb of Mother Earth. And the sun rises on the winter solstice or the summer solstice and penetrates and impregnates through the the channel up to the center of the henge and refertilizes the world. I mean, that's what it was all about. It was procreation. And so we have this womb structure again as being Mother Earth, and then obviously the sun is the male, and it's a fertilization between the sun and the earth, part and parcel of all the same story. But interesting that it happens, as you say, across the world in so many places at the same time.